Welcome to the Journey of an Aesthete podcast, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human.
Who can turn the world on with her smile? Who can take a nothing day and suddenly make it all seem worthwhile? Well, it's you, girl, and you should know it. With each glance and every little movement you show it. Love is all around, no need to waste it. You can have the town, why don't you take it?
It's Mitch Hampton, and welcome to our podcast, Journey of an Aesthete.
Oh, it's great to be here. Great to be talking to you again.
Yes, it's been a while. Although I should say, if you don't mind, I always say a few words about the guest up front. I think you are an innovative historian, and your book on the 70s, called The 70s, is now a classic in history. And you are a scholar, and you're an expert on Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter and presidential historian and probably many other things that I haven't covered or even know about. And you've taught at Boston University for the longest time, and I think I was one of the early boosters of your book, right, back in 2001.
Yeah, absolutely.
and I also think, if I'm not mistaken, the last time I saw you in person was at the Pete's Coffee, right, in Cambridge, I think.
I think so, and I don't even remember how long ago that was, but a few years now, probably.
Yeah, I would say it's probably 5 or 6 years. But the thing I wanted one of the major reasons I wanted you to be on our show is you were the first person to sort of change the conversation about American history and about the 60s and 70s and introduced the concept, I guess, of the lawn 70s. And, on our show, you could talk about personal biography, of course, your political activism as a teenager and teaching and your unusual teaching methods at Boston University, where you would show up in costume the last day of class, right? You would wear a Kiana shirt or a Nick shirt, right? And is this true that you...
Yeah, I've got a good memory.
Yeah. And to sort of demonstrate what the 70s were like. But getting more serious, did you want to start with sort of a linear chronology and talk about before we discuss the 70s, your journey as a scholar and historian, or how you came to history as a discipline? Or...
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really, a couple of different answers to that question. I mean, looking back on it now, I don't think I realized it at the time, but a formative experience, and I'm sorry that this is so cliched, but one of the reasons that I became a historian was because of a high school history teacher who kind of shook up my understanding of what history was about and what historians did. And that, this was a time, in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up, when history education was, for the most part, really bad. It was memorizing names and dates and lists of events. There was very little understanding of context. There was very little asking questions of trying to understand how history and historical perspective might inform the way that we could be in the world today and help us function as critical thinkers about the society that we lived in. Mm-hmm. And this high school teacher of mine, a guy named Charlie Backfish, who, as it turned out, had started a PhD program in history, never finished, went into high school teaching instead.
Okay.
But he brought art and music, especially music. He kind of moonlighted as a DJ on a local radio station.
That's beautiful.
Into the teaching of history. And he also exposed us to a variety of different perspectives and points of view. He didn't use a textbook. I mean, he handed out the textbook because he was required to, but we didn't use that textbook. And instead, we learned about the way different historians had approached and come up with different conclusions about different issues. And I remember him, he also had a knack for drawing contemporary parallels. So when we were discussing Andrew Jackson and the spoil system right around Halloween,
wow.
Well, the Halloween practices in my suburban town of, people putting toilet paper on the houses of those people that didn't give out good candy,
right.
So it was a way of sort of dealing with the issue of corruption in American life. But if that was kind of one thing that, got me started on it, I think that for me, kind of coming of age in the 1970s, that history appealed because I saw it as a mode of social criticism, as a way to understand my own society and to intervene in ongoing debates about the nature and direction of American society. I had friends in graduate school, like I had a friend whose field was the history of medieval Russia. And I asked her, why? What was it about that field that interested her? And for her, she said she wanted to find something that was as far removed, as totally remote and different from the world that she lived in as she could imagine. And that blew my mind because for me, history was a way, and I thought the best way to try to understand the present crisis and to have an opportunity to kind of bring something to current debates.
That's a beautiful response. I mean, I actually don't mind corniness or even cliche if it's truthful. I mean, that teacher, that Mr. was it Babbitt? Backfish was a great teacher, and he inspired your thought and the direction of your life. So we got to give him a lot of credit for that in high school. Was this in the East Coast in New York or Massachusetts? What part of?
It was on Long Island, so about 50 miles outside of New York City in Suffolk County, Long Island. So not far from SUNY Stony Brook, if you know where that is.
Yep.
And a town called Smithtown, New York. Yeah. So it was a sort of a classic, cookie cutter suburban development. People lived in these, mass produced tract homes in the tract where I grew up. So I lived there from the time I was in fourth grade until I graduated from high school. And, you bought either the ranch house or the colonial. We had the colonial, which was the 2-story house with columns. And there was a big storm, a hurricane that came through, and it knocked down all the columns, but didn't do any damage. So we learned that the columns were fake. They were hollow. They weren't actually, they were just there for show. They didn't actually support any weight.
Well, that's kind of a theme of the 70s, of course, if we think about the paranoia movies, especially all the Parallax View and 3 Days of the Condor. Things aren't as they seem. There's this secret, right? There's a kind of secret behind the scenes machinations of power, I guess. But not to get too further afield. But do you mind discussing for our listeners, audience, the Lawn 70s? Because I've often felt that the 70s is from 68 to 84.
I don't mind at all. And I should say by sort of word of caution, at the beginning that, it may even be worth talking about why it is that we, especially that modern people, the people of the 20th century, and especially 20th century Americans, tend to reckon historical time in decades, and that we kind of see ourselves as a 70s person or an 80s person or a 90s person or a 60s person.
That's right.
And that we understand decades not just as chronological units, but as cultural and political units, as markers of different eras with different kinds of sensibilities. It seems to me that that was kind of a characteristic way of thinking about time in the in 20th century United States, and in more and more in the late 20th century world. I think, and maybe I'm wrong about this, and maybe you can prove me wrong, but it strikes me in the 21st century that reckoning in decades has kind of gone a little bit by the wayside, that we don't tend to think in decades and identify ourselves with decades quite as strongly as we did in, let's say, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
Right.
But I think, that gets at, so understanding, of course, that, history, important events, important sensibilities that forms people's identity, their sense of self, their sense of their place in the broader culture, those don't neatly follow years that end in zero.
Right.
But I think there's something to think about a period having a specific zeitgeist or a specific set of sensibilities, shared common experiences, shared ways of looking at the world, and that, and for me, the 1970s I saw as this formative period in the experience of the modern United States, and not only formative but transformative.
Absolutely.
In many ways, and that 70s I see as a period that really begins, at the end of the 60s, with the failure of the most utopian aspirations and social movements of the 1960s and 1968, with the election of Richard Nixon as president, and some of those disappointments. And that really extends, through the early 80s, which I see as being very much in part with the spirit of the 70s. But that 1984, and especially if we think about, the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics with their confident, assertive patriotism, and the landslide reelection of Ronald Reagan as kind of marking the end of the long 70s. So for me, I see the 70s as a period that extends from, 1968 to 1984. Now, of course, there are people that, draw those distinctions differently. There are historians who instead invoke a kind of long 1960s that doesn't end until 1973 or 1974. So there's certainly some debate about that.
Well, there is debate, and I'm on your side, Bruce, on this, because I feel kind of strongly about it. I think that you have the periodization exactly right. It occurs to me, I'm thinking about Woodstock and Studio 54. I often comment, though people were a little puzzled that there's some similarity between them, even though they're, on the face of it, they're opposite, right? One is inclusive and, not so, and one is more exclusive, outdoors, indoors. But I sort of think that maybe thinking about these two big events, they share an ethos, don't they, in a certain...
Absolutely. I think they do share an ethos, and and to some extent they share an ethos that seems to me to be one of the overarching theme of the 1970s, which is, a battle between established authority and a kind of rebellious hostility to those kinds of conventions, the celebration of a new ethos of liberation. And Studio 54, even if it's indoor and exclusionary in some ways, is still got that, raised middle finger at established conventional sources of authority in American life, and it's still advancing a kind of ethic of personal liberation. It also, I think you can see in both of those examples, the struggles of different alternative cultures or subcultures to express themselves. So, I think you are you're right, I think, to see that kind of an odd coupling in these two phenomena that on the surface seem to be so different from each other, but that they shared a lot in common.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to evoke. I mean, when you talk about historians on the other side of the debate that want to make everything the 60s, I sort of think, in a sense, do you think some of that is generational, that those historians are perhaps older? There may be boomer historians, or they're historians who, if you will, sort of prefer the 60s, and they're sort of cemented. They kind of buy into the old idea that the 70s are an in-between decade, right? That was the thing, right? It was a nothing of a decade. Tom Wolfe, remember Tom Wolfe's in 1980 in Esquire magazine, he says, in between, he says, this was a wild decade. This was anything but a sleeper decade. But I sort of think that part of it could be generational. But I don't want to.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things I cop to that in the preface or the introduction to my book on the 70s, in which I say that, every generation invents their own traditions, and, I'm doing some inventing right there.
Absolutely.
I think that, one of the interesting things is, and one of the defining features maybe of late 20th century American life, and this is something that I would say continues today, is that, as individuals, we tend to be formed. We develop our political beliefs and our cultural allegiances, the kinds of movies, music, food we like and think is valuable, at a certain point in the life cycle, in those late teens and 20s, at the time that people are in high school or in college. Those are formative experiences. And so one tends to, have strong associations with that era in which one came of age. But beyond that, I think that, I was going to say in the American historical profession, but it goes beyond the historical profession throughout the culture, that boomer generation, and especially those people who came of age in the 1960s and participated in the social unrest of the 1960s, that, they have been for most of, it's starting to change. It started to change in the last 10 or 20 years, but for most of the last half century, they have been the ones who have controlled the levers of power. They're the ones who are running the record companies, the movie studios, the Congress, and so on. And so I think that is I think that generational politics is a very strong thing. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about cultural items, because I remember in your teaching, because you teach a class on post-1967, like a survey class, I think you still teach that, and I remember you chose some really, really what I think of as hit movies, and they're movies that maybe people have forgotten about. Like you were actually showing How to Beat the High Cost of Living, I think, with Susan St. James, and were you still showing that? And you were showing Fun with Dick and Jane with the George Segal, Jane Fonda.
First of all, Mitch, credit has to go where it's due, and props to you on How to Beat the High Cost of Living.
Really?
Because in that class where I look at, there's this whole kind of genre of what I would call, 70s caper films or middle-class caper films.
Yep.
Films like Fun with Dick and Jane. To some extent, it's not a middle class, it's a working class. It's a union guy's film, Blue Collar. Which, of course, that starred Richard Pryor, Harvey Keitel, and Yaphet Kotto, who sadly, we just passed away today or yesterday. I just heard about it today. But these are films, and I didn't include in that class How to Beat the High Cost of Living. And a conversation with you that probably now goes back almost 20 years is, you had turned me on to that film, and now I use it extensively. In fact, I use, a scene from that film in talking about that kind of mini genre in which the economic squeezes of the late 70s cause otherwise respectable people to go on these capers to try to make the big score. And How to Beat the High Cost of Living is a great example of that. I also, that film has one of the weirdest but most wonderful opening credit sequences. It's a cartoon credit sequence, and that is a rich text to think about American popular culture in so many different ways.
Yeah, I do like that credit sequence a lot. I mean, it was common to do creative sequences, especially in comedies, right? At that time, like that sequence. But there's so many one-liners in that. It's so well written. Robert Kaufman's script, I think. About and so, how do students respond? Again, they're living 40 years hence to these jokes about the cost of bread and milk and the Safeway and Fred Willard is having to sleep in a garage with one of the protagonists to save energy or something or money, or there's all these. What do they take from that, or what do they? I'm just curious as their response to, jokes about economic hardship and.
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, that I always, I'm always reminded that the history and the studying and teaching and thinking about history is a constant conversation between the past and the present, and that we're always asking different questions about the past. And you can really see that over the years that I've shown that film in class and discussed it, reactions to it change. So, for instance, it really resonated in the, immediate aftermath of the Great Recession, in 2009, 10, at the bottom of the recession, when, that moment really spoke to the present. And in fact, some of the fears and insecurities of that moment, of that people thought that they weren't going to get the opportunities that their parents had, that they were going to have to struggle to find jobs when they graduated from college, that they couldn't necessarily rely on the things that they had come to expect. But those kind of themes of that film, those economic themes resonated very strongly. But then in more recent times, students have really kind of focused on the presentation of gender and gender roles in that film, and the ways that the film kind of reinforces some sort of kind of very traditionally sexist notions about femininity, especially, but also the kind of, somewhat, a whole series of interesting and, for them, unusual depictions of male gender identity and sexuality.
Yeah, I'm wondering about that because, the Dabney Coleman figure, as always, is sort of a buffoon. So much like as in 9 to 5, it's a gentler. He's the cop, right? So he's not as bad as the boss in 9 to 5, but he's close to that. I always thought that those depictions were critical of those male attitudes. They certainly weren't. They weren't endorsing it. And I think it's the same. Yeah. I think it's the same.
And the Richard Benjamin character is also interesting too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, do you think he's doing a redo of Diary of a Mad Housewife, right? The husband to Terry Snodgrass in Diary of a Mad Housewife. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting reference. Yeah.
So, but works of art, of course, always are going to change how they're perceived, and they're of course, that's only natural. I was wondering, were you one of the first scholars to sort of write about disco in a new way, or in a more sort of positive, or more or at least, talk about the disco sex phenomenon as kind of reactionary and sort of bigoted? I think you were one of the first.
That was, I don't really think, and I could be wrong about this, there were some very smart music critics and music journalists who had, Nelson George would be one example, who I think had written, in smart and sensitive ways about disco as a cultural phenomenon, and had not just kind of, dismissed it as empty, or, at least tried to understand it, its sort of economics, its politics, and so on. And there are a couple of other journalists who had kind of written in that way, and that, to some extent inspired me to take a deeper look at it. But I can't think of any other historian who had, taken disco seriously as a topic for historical analysis. And to me, I thought, disco played an important part in the kind of evolution of the American dialogue about race, as well as, of course, dealing with sort of questions of sexuality and gender as well, but especially to kind of seeing disco as, in some ways, the last gasp, but as an important part, an important iteration of the integrationist impulse in American race relations at a time when it was under attack from all sides. And also then to try to take seriously the Disco Sucks movement, and to try to ask, well, what was really going on underneath those chants of disco sucks, and some of the more egregious and dramatic examples of anti-disco sentiment, the most famous of which, of course, was Disco Demolition Night at Chicago's Comiskey Park in 1979.
Right.
Where, where they, people were invited to watch the demolition of a mountain of disco records on the field in between games of the doubleheader, but people started setting their own records afire in the stands, and basically a riot ensued that spilled out into the streets of Chicago.
Yeah, that was really something. I've often, I'm glad to speak a little bit about it. You've written very sensitively and in complex ways about Jimmy Carter, of course, and you got to meet Jimmy Carter. Is this true? Were you part of a thing at the Presidential Library, or was there a?
Yeah. So at this point, the only president of the United States that I've ever met in person and had a chance to shake hands with was Jimmy Carter. To kind of set the scene for you, this goes back now quite a ways. This was in 1997, so it was on the 20th anniversary of his inauguration as president, which was, of course, in January of 1977. And there was a conference at the Carter Center in Atlanta in which a variety of different historians who had been kind of the first wave of historians to actually use the archives there. So it was the kind of first studies of Jimmy Carter based on a serious engagement in the archives at the Carter Library. And we had a conference to kind of present what we had found, and Jimmy and Rosalind Carter were not only invited, but they came, and they not only came to a social event to sort of press the flesh with everyone, but they sat for what they called a historical news conference. And so with a room with about 50 historians in it, Jimmy and Rosalind sat at the front of the room for about 90 minutes, and they answered our questions. And, at that point, it was pretty amazing, because at that point it was hard to imagine a president of the United States who would do that or who could do that. I suppose you could imagine Barack Obama or Bill Clinton doing that now, but of course, the examples we had, that seemed so unusual at the time. And sometimes he actually, quite honestly said he didn't remember things when he was asked very specific. Some of the historians asked him very specific questions. But that was That was a great experience. And I think I was, the thing about Jimmy Carter is that even though, looking back on it, I don't think you can say his presidency was successful. You can't help but develop, admiration for Carter as a person. And of course, his long post-presidential career, Carter essentially defined or transformed or redefined the historical phenomenon of the post-presidency.
Yes, that's true.
Has only, has made him look better in retrospect than he did when he was all but run out of Washington in January of 1981.
I'm wondering, of course, we've been through so many traumatic, tumultuous events of the past 5 years, of course, 6 years, 10, 20 years. It's really something. I mean, I'm sure as a historian, you look at it in a particular way, and have a lot of ideas about what we've been through. Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thank you. One thing on a more lighter note, perhaps, than heavier note, is there's a kind of a DIY, do-it-yourself aesthetic to the internet age about, new platforms. And this podcast is made possible by people doing tech things and that maybe is a holdover from the 70s, right? Because it was a do-it-yourself sort of craft-oriented aspect to the 70s, right? And so maybe that's a harkening back to that, or maybe not. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, absolutely. I absolutely. And I think in some ways it's maybe, and part of, not only was there that kind of DIY movement in the 70s, but I think that part of what it pointed toward, right, was a kind of dissatisfaction with the institutions, the opportunities, the ways of doing things that were out there, and a desire to kind of go outside of and around them and establish new platforms and new places for people to express different kinds of voices. And we can see that in many different, aspects of American life. And also a desire, I think, to get around or go against what we're seeing as the gatekeepers of American culture, and to develop kind of alternative cultural streams. Mm-hmm. Today we have that on overdrive, and maybe it's even gone a little bit too far, because there are some crazies out there.
Well, there's a whole. I mean,
maybe not a. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to add to that. I mean, I actually think there's a sinister side to that, because you get a mentality like we've had in our very own government of wanting to destroy things, just to destroy them, just because they come from the past, and kind of it's almost a reckless violence. I don't need. Of course, you will agree with that, and that's a whole that's a whole problem.
Absolutely.
And I don't even know what you think of as an historian the effects of that going forward, or if we can heal from that, or mitigation against it, or Biden, or maybe there is an integrationist ethic in Biden, possibly in Harris. Maybe you observe that with.
I think it's really, I'm going to give you the worst historian's cop-out answer to that question. And there are lots of things we can hope, but it really is too soon to tell.
Yeah, of course.
I think that, people, a lot of people, including many distinguished historians, in the aftermath of Barack Obama's election and inauguration, saw that as a turning point in American history. In fact, The very famous Princeton University historian Sean Wilentz published a book about the period before called The Age of Reagan, 1980 to 2008. And the idea was that Obama's election kind of represented this turning point in American life, that the period of political conservatism and culture war that had kind of defined the age of Reagan had ended finally, and that would give way to this new, era, more cosmopolitan and politically liberal era. It was possible to think that in, 2009, 2010. No, not anticipating, what came after and what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years. And so I think that, there's a lot of potential for Biden to make a big difference. And I think it strikes me that there is evidence that the rejection of the idea that government can have any kind of necessary or positive role in national life that was such a defining feature of the last 30 or 40 years, that for the first time, I see, some change in that, and Biden is trying to harness that. But will he be able to? I don't know. I think there are some deep-seated, structural forces that will make it hard for him to accomplish that change. So, invite me back in 2 or 3 years and we'll see if it's made a difference.
Well, I certainly will. I mean, it's interesting. I'm thinking a lot about Lyndon Johnson because you've written a book on him and from the in the modern presidency. And I know that I don't know if this is connected, but you went to Oxford University. Do you want to talk about first about your impressions of Johnson, who's a very complex figure in his history, and much is written about him, and then some of the work you've been doing on early American history, right? Or earlier, I don't know or your impressions of Oxford University in general, which seems like quite a place.
Well, you're gonna have to invite me back for that because sadly, COVID, that was a casualty of COVID-19. So I was in fact supposed to be at Oxford right now. I was supposed to spend this entire academic year at Oxford, but that got canceled because of the pandemic, or rather postponed. And so I'm now planning to spend the 2022-2023 academic year at Oxford. So sadly, that didn't work out for this year.
So
but
it's in the future.
I suppose in some ways it's good because I would have been, quarantined the whole time. Johnson obviously is a fascinating figure. I think a kind of towering figure in American political history. I think it's really interesting what has happened with Johnson's reputation over time. And of course, the rankings and reputations of U.S. presidents often change over time. Some move up the ladder and others move down. Johnson has moved up quite a lot, I think, since he left office. I think for a couple of different reasons. One reason, of course, is that distance between the end of the Vietnam War and now, and so that Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, which was the main reason that he was such a controversial and in some ways maligned figure, that has sort of receded more into the past, whereas Johnson's domestic presidency, and especially his effectiveness at getting legislation through Congress, at promoting voting rights, at creating and expanding a social safety net, that not only have those seemed like enduring legacies of his presidency, but his ability to get those things done seems astounding to us, with our recognition of just how hard it is to make that government work so well, so effectively.
Bryan Cranston, I'm wondering your impressions of his representation or portrayal of Johnson in All the Way. Quite an actor.
Yeah, he's a great actor. I think that's, there have been, quite a few now, filmic, Johnson has sort of appeared in film. He appeared controversially in that film Selma, which I found it strange that Johnson defenders, including people like Joe Califano, who had been one of his close advisors in the White House, and others were so horrified by that movie. I actually didn't think it was so negative a depiction of Johnson. I mean, Johnson is a colorful figure, very earthy,
Yeah.
certainly, a hardball politician in ways that, maybe do not fit the standards of this time, would make some people queasy about.
Sure.
But someone who was a believer in the necessity and possibility of government as the expression of the collective interests of the American people. Someone that thought that government could and should do good things for people, and that could also be the instrument to create a kind of national community in which no one was left behind. And, those, in the rearview mirror, those commitments of Johnson look better, I think.
Well, that's the good Johnson, right? Or that's the part of Johnson
Right.
that you'd have to be really, I guess, blind to not praise, or not, at least not respect. I was wondering if you had the possibility right now in this very moment in this show to have a skeptical interlocutor, one of those imagined people I mentioned at the beginning who think everything's about the 60s and the 60s is everything. The 70s was like nothing 10 years. What are some things you could mention to this person that would just settle it, that would just make clear that, hey, you take a second look of 68 to 84, all these things that changed the world forever in ways that didn't even exist in the 60s. What that comes to mind? It could be an overarching philosophy or a tendency or events or whatever. I don't know what you would say to such a person, and what would you?
Well, I mean, you know what? I'm not going to evade your question. I'm going to try to answer it, but I do think that it would be hard to convince that person.
Yeah.
It would be hard to convince that person. I mean, not only I think does that kind of reflect the still continued dominance of that 60s generation and the romantic view of the 60s,
Okay.
capital letters, bright light 60s.
Yeah.
But also because the iconic events of the 60s, I think, tend to fit the conventional model of historical changes. We are talking about, social movements, protests, wars, elections, whereas the iconic events of the 1970s, I think, focus more on, transformations that are economic, that are cultural, that are regional, that are sexual, and that are perhaps, fewer dramatic, symbolic incidents and more consequential processes and transformations. So, for instance, I would just give you, just to choose one out of many examples. Right now, anybody who's coming of age right now, most of your listeners, I'm sure, will take for granted that women will be, in the workplace, that they will have women co-workers on the job, that there will be women classmates in their schools, that they might not only have women colleagues, but also women bosses in some cases, and that women will be participating in sports, that women will be directing movies, you name it. That is kind of I would say, a foundational assumption of American life today, and yet that's something that happened during the 1970s.
Absolutely.
And we could point to examples of very important kind of turning points along the way there, but really, it's in the decade of the 1970s that for the first time, the majority of American women started to work outside the home, that conventional ideas about marriage and divorce and child rearing changed, that new expectations for gender roles, that women entered the professions. Not only did they have jobs, but more and more they had careers. So that's a kind of dramatic transformation that affects the daily lived experience of women, men, families, you name it, which I think is really, really, important. And so that's just one example among many. I think also, if you kind of think of the United States for most of its history and certainly through the 1960s, regionally, it was dominated by, what we might call the Frost Belt or the Rust Belt, as it came to be known in the 1970s. That is the Northeast and northern industrial Midwest. That had been not only the economic engine of the country, but its primary source of political power and cultural production, really almost going back to colonial times. Well, during the 1970s, that changed. Not only political power and economic resources, but also more and more kind of cultural authority and experimentation transferred south and west. And so that regional power shift is another really kind of important transformation of that time. And then, if I kind of try to think about popular culture of the United States today and what I would see as its dominant, kind of in-your-face sensibility, that really is a product not of the 60s, but of the 1970s. Whether you're thinking about the iconoclastic films of directors like Martin Scorsese or Roman Polanski or, punk rock or the irreverent comedy of Saturday Night Live, that so much of the contemporary cultural sensibility of the kinds of institutions in which cultural products are made and distributed kind of took shape in the 1970s. So, that's maybe a long-winded answer to your question, but
well, maybe unnecessary because you had to include all of that, of course. But I was wondering about the arts and popular culture. You come back to the arts again and again, and I guess there was a time in which these weren't used in teaching history, right? I mean, maybe 60 years ago. From what I understand, nobody talked about movies or TV shows or books, and of course now we take that for granted, right? When you're studying a subject, you have to study the culture, in the arts. What changes do you see happening in your field in terms of the way the arts are discussed? Not so much that they're discussed, but what people are interested in or looking at in streaming television or any of the rest of it. What comes to mind when you think about music? Or I know that's a big question, but
yeah, I think that that's a really good question, and it's a difficult question to ask. I do think that, one of the things that I've learned recently as my interests and my writing have moved back in time into the early 20th century, the period between roughly 1900 and 1930, is that there are a lot of things that I thought of as new that I'm finding, antecedents, back in that period. I think that, And I think that in some ways, the decade of the 1920s is really interesting and important because that's, even though people at the time maybe didn't understand it, people who later looked back at that time, even who looked back at it from soon thereafter, saw it as creating a kind of defining characteristic of modern American life, which was the emergence and development of a mass culture that featured a kind of frenetic, media-induced consumerism on a colossal scale, and that the gradual shift from what had been a kind of an industrial, producer-driven economy in which people mainly took their identities from what they produced, that is, from their jobs, to a consumer society in which people took their identities largely from the kinds of things they consumed, and that kind of mirrored a political shift from a largely face-to-face politics dominated by local party organizations, those fabled political machines, to the kind of mass-mediated politics that we are familiar with today.
Yeah.
And so, and they create, I mean, if I can kind of quote, the line of a classic historian, the historian Lawrence Levine, he described mass culture as, he called it the folklore of industrial capitalism. And by that he meant that in the way that folklore or folk culture had kind of functioned for pre-modern, pre-industrial societies, that for a modern industrial civilization, mass culture, so popular music, radio and television, movies, spectator sports, mass circulation magazines, national advertising campaigns. Later on, of course, things like social media, streaming video, the internet, etc. That that they kind of took on new importance, and that they kind of revealed the changing state of human experience and of the public mind. And so, scholars disagree about the timing of, this kind of new modern sensibility, this kind of cross-fertilization of politics and popular culture, because now we don't see politics and culture as being two different realms. We understand how much they overlap. I mean, Saturday Night Live is an enduring institution that testifies to that blending of or erosion of the boundaries between what we used to think of as politics or culture. I mean, much as Richard Nixon's 1968 appearance on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In kind of helped to break down those barriers. So maybe I'm sort of drifting away from the question, but I think that, one of the ways that historians have tried to deal with arts and culture is not to put it off in a separate realm, either high culture or low culture, and looking at it exclusively as cultural products, but seeing it as, the ways that, I guess one of the ways I'd say it is that that popular culture and mass consumption are, they're not just kind of the detritus or the fads and fashions and follies, but they are the principal ways through which at least 20th century Americans and 21st century Americans communicate with each other, the way they enter and participate in the marketplace, the way they make sense of themselves and the world around them. And I think trying to integrate culture, the arts, with politics and economics has been one of the ways that historians have recently addressed it, because it's important to understand, as much as we might want a elevated and pure art to exist, that in the contemporary United States, you can't separate artistic production and artistic audiences from the kind of market mechanisms in which they are produced and distributed.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean, you as in one of your many different identities as a musician certainly must know that, and
Yep.
the way that the changing structures of the market, for the culture industries, they affect the kind of art that's being produced and the way it's being, heard and consumed.
Oh, absolutely. All things come to an end, even good things like this episode, and I can feel that this is inevitable. But before that, I have one final thing I wanted to ask you, because I think you might have something really interesting to say about it. What does it mean to think historically? What does someone like you or Jill Lepore or Sean Willents, what is it? How do you see things? I guess what I mean is thinking historically. What gains does an individual? What does an individual person gain when they have a historical lens, as opposed to some other kind of lens? It's like another field. What do you think is the advantage there?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, that is that's a great question, and it's a big question, and I guess let me try to answer it in two different ways. And one way is you might not know it, your listeners might not know it, but we are all historians in our daily lives. We are all historians, and that is whether we are trying to decide, what our business should do in the next quarter, or we're trying to make sense of a breakup in our romantic relationship, or we're trying to decide who to vote for in the next election. You name it. That what we're doing is we're acting like a historian, because we are looking at the universe of data we have about what's happened before. We are selecting from that broad universe the things that we think are important, and we are crafting narratives and arguments. That is, we're telling stories that make sense of what happened before that we think might inform our future decisions. And we are also making arguments, explanations as to why things happen that can inform our future decisions. So whether we like it or not, we are all historians. We all need a historian's toolkit in order to navigate the world. The problem is some people don't realize it, and they don't bring that toolkit along. And so they don't do a very good job of selecting the things from that broad universe of our past experiences that are relevant and important, and organizing them in a way that makes sense of the past. And so I think that, that my first answer to the question is that we really, to make our way in the world, we need that historical perspective, that sense of where we came from, where we might be going, how did the decisions that we or other people in the past have made determine and delimit the possibilities we have now. That's really important. But there's also, I think, another side to that, and another thing that we get from a historical perspective, because history functions for a community, a society, a nation like the United States, or some subset of it, much the way I think that memory functions for an individual. And without it, we're kind of like someone with amnesia, like that person that wakes up on the soap opera and doesn't know, who they are or where they were or whatnot. And when you have that amnesia, that makes you vulnerable. It makes you vulnerable to being manipulated by the loudest, most obnoxious voices around you. It makes you unable to conceive of alternatives to what those in power are saying and doing, and not only to conceive those alternatives, but to work toward their realization.
Wow.
So to be a truly liberated, thinking, free person, you need that historical imagination, much as to be a functioning individual, you need to have a working memory.
Well, Bruce Schulman, that's a perfect conclusion to this episode. I can't think of a better, I actually can't think of a more articulate expression of what you do and what this episode's about than that. I really thank you.
It was a pleasure.
I really thank you for your generosity and time, and I hope that the next time we speak that you finally do get to Oxford University as was planned. So thank you.
Well, yes, I hope so too, and I look forward to seeing you out about town like I normally do when things get back to normal. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care.